The day began quietly at the ITV studios, the kind of calm start everyone expected before the usual flow of celebrity interviews and morning chatter. Cliff Richard, one of Britain's most respected performers, arrived with the same easy grace he had carried throughout his six-decade career. At 78, he still had the warmth and humility that made him beloved by studio workers and viewers alike. He greeted the makeup staff with jokes, thanked the technicians adjusting his microphone, and radiated the familiar steady charm that made him a favorite guest. Like, "Before we move on, don't forget to hit subscribe button." But beneath the normal routine, something was off. Several people noticed that Lorraine Kelly, normally cheerful and smooth in her pre-show interactions, was unusually tense. She snapped at a lighting cue, rushed through her notes, and carried a sharpness in her voice that made younger staff nervous. No one knew why she seemed on edge, but the uneasiness lingered in the air as the show moved closer to going live. Cliff settled into the interview chair, ready to talk about his new album, a collection of classic songs he had reinterpreted with his own style. He expected a pleasant, familiar conversation. Lorraine had interviewed him many times. He trusted her to handle things with professionalism. As the cameras rolled and the countdown finished, Cliff smiled warmly, prepared for a relaxed segment. Lorraine opened with the usual polished introduction, but her first question carried an unexpected sting. Instead of asking about the creative choices behind the album, she questioned whether recording covers was safe and lacking ambition. Cliff responded with patience, explaining the beauty of interpreting timeless music, but Lorraine's tone sharpened again. She pressed him about taking risks, implying that at his age he was leaning on nostalgia rather than artistry. The discomfort in the studio grew. Cliff tried to steer the conversation back to the music, but Lorraine pushed further, asking if he should step aside to make space for younger performers. The comment hit with a cold, unmistakable cruelty. Audience members stiffened in their seats, exchanging uneasy glances. Cliff's polite smile faded, replaced by confusion and hurt. He reminded her that age didn't diminish passion or creativity. But Lorraine kept going, almost as if his calm replies provoked her. Her questions became more pointed, more personal. She suggested he was clinging to relevance, accused him of being overly sensitive, and brushed off his attempts to answer sincerely. The atmosphere shifted from an interview to a confrontation. Even the camera operators hesitated, unsure where to aim their lenses as the tension mounted. Cliff's composure held, barely. He reminded Lorraine that he had faced challenging interviewers before, but that this felt different, deliberate, and unnecessarily cruel. Lorraine responded with a smug smile and a comment about his generation not handling honesty, drawing a collective grimace from the audience. The hostility had moved beyond awkward. It was becoming painful to watch. Cliff straightened in his seat, the dignity that defined his entire career shining through his frustration. He told her clearly that he had come to speak about music, not to defend his right to exist in the industry. Lorraine ignored the warning in his voice and pushed again, accusing him of avoiding real journalism. That was the moment something broke. Cliff, long known for his steady grace, finally stood up. His movement was measured, but the meaning behind it was unmistakable. He informed Lorraine that the interview was over. Lorraine tried to taunt him into staying, mocking him for walking away, but the power in Cliff's stance silenced even the crew. He spoke firmly, telling her that interviews were meant to explore ideas, not tear down guests for sport. For the first time since the segment began, Lorraine faltered. Her confidence slipped as Cliff confronted her point by point, repeating her own words back to her with the weight of truth. Her attacks, her insinuations, her dismissal of his career, all of it was laid bare in front of millions of viewers. The studio was frozen. No one breathed. Cliff's voice grew steadier as he spoke about the value of creativity at any age, about the importance of continuing to share art regardless of how long one has been doing it. His words weren't angry. They were resolute, dignified, and painfully honest. Then, without another glance at Lorraine, Cliff walked off the set, leaving her alone, shaken, and visibly stunned as the cameras continued rolling. For several seconds after Cliff Richard disappeared behind the curtains, the studio hung in a suspended silence. Viewers at home saw Lorraine sitting alone, stunned, blinking as if trying to understand what had just unfolded on her own set. The crew waited for her to recover, but she seemed frozen, her usual polished composure shattered by the public confrontation she never expected to lose. Finally, the director cut to a commercial break, but the damage had already been done. Inside the studio, the moment the cameras faded, whispers erupted among the staff. Some stared at Lorraine with disbelief. Others exchanged glances that said everything. She went too far. The floor manager marched up to the table, speaking in a controlled but stern voice, asking what had happened and why the interview had turned hostile. Lorraine brushed him off, insisting she had only asked honest questions, but even she could hear the doubt in her own voice. Meanwhile, Cliff was in the hallway, steadying himself against the wall, not out of weakness, but out of sheer emotional exhaustion. A few crew members hurried to him, apologizing profusely, assuring him that they had never witnessed anything like that on the show. Cliff politely thanked them, though his face still held the shock of the encounter. He had handled criticism before, harsh interviews, even controversies. But something about Lorraine's attack felt personal, targeted, almost premeditated. Within minutes, the incident began spreading across social media. Clips were replayed, dissected, and posted with captions of disbelief. Viewers who had watched the show live were already taking sides, but the overwhelming reaction was sympathy for Cliff. Comment sections filled with outrage at Lorraine's approach. How could she speak to him like that? Cliff Richard deserves respect. He's a legend. This is bullying, not journalism. By the time the show returned from break, Lorraine appeared visibly rattled. She attempted to continue with the next segment, but her voice trembled, and she stumbled over her lines. Viewers noticed, producers noticed, everyone noticed. The warmth that normally carried her show was gone, replaced by an uneasy stiffness she couldn't hide. Backstage, Cliff spoke quietly with his manager, who was furious on his behalf. They discussed whether they should issue a statement immediately or let the footage speak for itself. Cliff, ever the gentleman, didn't want to ignite a scandal, but he also refused to downplay what he had just endured. "The truth is already out there," he said. "People saw exactly what happened." As he prepared to leave the building, several younger staff members approached him shyly to express their admiration and regret. Cliff smiled at each one, grateful for their kindness. The contrast between their sincerity and the hostility he'd faced minutes earlier only made the whole situation feel more surreal. Inside the control room, executives replayed the footage repeatedly, their faces growing more serious each time. Lorraine's behavior wasn't just sharp. It was aggressive, unprofessional, and undeniably damaging. They debated what the fallout would be once the press picked up the story. The possibility of multiple complaints, long-term reputation harm, and even calls for accountability loomed heavily. Lorraine, alone in her dressing room afterward, stared at her reflection. The adrenaline that fueled her confrontation had burned off, replaced by a cold fear creeping into her chest. She replayed her own words in her mind, each one sounding harsher and more reckless than she remembered. She had thought she was in control, that pushing Cliff would create a moment for TV. Instead, she had created a disaster, and the reaction was already slipping beyond her grasp. By that afternoon, entertainment reporters were flooding social platforms with summaries, while fans of Cliff Richard organized hashtags defending him. It didn't take long for viewers to start demanding explanations, apologies, and in some cases, consequences. But the most striking part of the entire ordeal was the clarity of the moment that replayed over and over. Cliff Richard, standing tall, delivering a message of dignity, age, creativity, and self-worth, while the host who had tried to belittle him sat speechless, caught by the sudden weight of her own cruelty. What had begun as a simple morning interview was now spiraling into one of the most talked-about television moments of the year. When the broadcast resumed after the commercial break, the energy inside the studio was nothing like the polished, calm viewers were accustomed to. Lorraine tried to reclaim her rhythm, reading from the teleprompter, but her usual confidence was nowhere to be found. Her voice wavered, her timing faltered, and she stumbled through remarks she normally delivered effortlessly. Even the guests waiting backstage sensed something was wrong. Everyone in the building had felt the impact of Cliff's departure, and even those who hadn't witnessed the interview live were hearing whispers about what had happened. By midday, the atmosphere in the network's offices had shifted. Producers and executives huddled in meetings, replaying the footage again and again, their faces tightening with concern. The broadcast hadn't just gone wrong, it had crossed a line that morning television rarely even approaches. Lorraine's questioning wasn't probing or journalistic. It had been personal, mocking, and increasingly hostile. Cliff's calm resistance made the contrast even more glaring. In every replay, Lorraine's tone looked harsher, while Cliff's dignity became more evident. The imbalance was unmistakable. Meanwhile, Cliff himself sat quietly in a small backstage lounge, decompressing. His manager and a few trusted staff members hovered near him, both protective and outraged. But Cliff didn't lash out or curse or demand action. He simply sat with a sad, thoughtful expression, processing the bizarre cruelty he had just experienced. He finally murmured to his manager, "I've never been spoken to like that on air, not once." And the simplicity of his statement carried more weight than any angry outburst could have. While Cliff left the building with a polite wave to staff, the outside world was erupting. Social media was exploding with clips of the confrontation, each one gathering thousands of comments. Fans expressed shock, anger, disbelief. Younger viewers who barely knew his catalog felt protective of him. Longtime fans were furious at the blatant disrespect. Comment sections filled with messages calling the interview a disgrace. Some viewers praised Cliff's restraint. Others accused the show of intentionally humiliating him for ratings. The debate was everywhere now, spreading far beyond morning TV circles. Lorraine, retreating to her dressing room after the show, felt the shift immediately. Her phone flooded with notifications, texts from colleagues asking if she was all right, messages from viewers demanding explanations, alerts from the press seeking comment. She ignored them all. For the first time in her career, she didn't know how to respond. In her mind, she replayed each of her questions, hearing them not as she thought she had delivered them, but as the world was now hearing them. Sharp, condescending, and at times shockingly cruel. She had believed she was pushing him, challenging him, maybe even creating a memorable on-air moment. But instead, she realized, she had lost control of both her tone and her judgment. The network's public relations department was already working on potential statements, anticipating the storm. Should they apologize? Should Lorraine deliver a clarification on the next episode? Should they wait and see how large the backlash grew? One thing was clear. This incident wasn't going away. Clips circulated faster than the network could react, and by early evening, even major news outlets were reporting on the confrontation. The narrative growing online was consistent. Cliff Richard had been disrespected, provoked, and humiliated, and his graceful exit only made Lorraine's behavior look worse. But the moment that defined the entire incident, the one replayed endlessly, was Cliff standing before the cameras, speaking not with anger, but with conviction. His message about age, passion, and the timelessness of creativity resonated with people of all generations. It wasn't just a rebuttal. It was a statement of identity and purpose. In contrast, Lorraine's silence in that moment, her stunned expression, revealed more than any of her earlier words. Viewers saw her realizing she had gone too far. It was a rare broadcast where the truth wasn't shaped by editing or scripting. It unfolded raw, unfiltered, impossible to reinterpret. As night settled and the online discussion only intensified, Cliff sat at home reflecting on the day. He hadn't wanted to create chaos or drama. He had simply reached his limit. He thought about the young artists he had mentored, about the fans who still filled concert halls, about the decades he had dedicated to music. One hostile interview could not diminish any of that. He felt hurt, certainly, but also strangely resolved. His message had reached people, and in a way he hadn't expected. Lorraine, on the other hand, sat in her quiet home, scrolling through comments she wished she hadn't read. The criticism was overwhelming. Some viewers were furious, some were disappointed, others demanded she apologize on air. The weight of it settled heavily on her shoulders. She had built a career on being relatable and kind, and now she was being accused of cruelty. And the worst part was that she couldn't argue with what people had seen. For once, she had no prepared lines, no comforting expression, no practiced warmth, only silence. Lorraine barely slept that night. Each time she closed her eyes, she saw Cliff turning away from her, saw the stunned audience, felt the air drain from the studio when he stood up. She replayed her own reactions, the defensive smirk, the dismissive tone, and each moment felt sharper, more unforgivable in the quiet of her living room. She had weathered criticism before, but never like this, never with so much evidence stacked plainly against her. By dawn, she knew the day ahead would be brutal. And she was right. When she arrived at the studio the next morning, the energy was different. People weren't rude, but they weren't warm either. Conversations paused when she walked into rooms. Assistants who usually greeted her with enthusiasm offered short nods instead. Even the coffee runner placed her mug quietly on the table without the usual small chat. Wordlessly, everyone was telling her the same thing. The world had seen what she did, and they didn't approve. Producers gathered in a tense meeting before the show. Lorraine was invited, but the discussion felt more like a tribunal than a planning session. They spoke in careful corporate tones about viewer trust, perceived hostility, and public response. No one said she had crossed a line. No one needed to. The fear in their voices told her everything. The show's brand, their ratings, the network's reputation, they were all suddenly fragile because of one disastrous interview. She sat with folded hands, pretending to listen, but her mind drifted constantly back to Cliff's face when she insulted him. She had never seen him look so wounded. Meanwhile, Cliff's world was transforming as well, but in the opposite direction. When he woke up that morning, his phone was overflowing, not with gossip or scandal, but with support. Fans sent messages of love and admiration. Fellow musicians reached out to praise his composure. Even people he hadn't spoken to in years contacted him to say they were proud of how he handled himself. He felt overwhelmed, touched, and still a bit shaken, but the kindness pouring in softened the sting of the previous day. But the media frenzy was only growing. Morning shows dissected the confrontation. Some replayed the footage in slow motion, pointing out every shift in tone, every raised eyebrow, every unkind implication. Analysts called it the most uncomfortable interview of the year. Commentators described Cliff's exit as dignified, powerful, necessary. Lorraine's performance, on the other hand, was described with words she never imagined associated with her name: hostile, cruel, unprovoked. The network executives felt the heat almost immediately. Advertisers asked questions. Viewer complaints doubled overnight. Social media accounts associated with the show struggled to post anything without being flooded with replies defending Cliff. The producers quietly reached out to Cliff's team, asking if he would be open to returning for a calmer follow-up segment. But the message they received was polite and firm. Cliff appreciated the offer, but he would not be returning to the show at this time. Lorraine heard about this rejection minutes later. For the first time since the incident, something inside her cracked. She stepped into the bathroom, locked the door, and allowed herself to feel the weight of what she had done. She had driven away a guest who had always shown her kindness. She had embarrassed herself, her show, and the network. Most painful of all, she had hurt someone she actually admired. She realized then that the disaster wasn't just professional, it was personal. She left the bathroom with swollen eyes, but a hardened resolve. She walked straight to the producer's office and said the words they had been waiting for, but didn't dare ask for. She would address the situation on air. Not a PR-filtered statement, not a scripted clarification. She would speak honestly, directly, and without excuses. The producers exchanged looks, surprised, relieved, uncertain, but they agreed. If you like this video, then subscribe.